After marching into the very heart of the Persian Empire to win a throne for a prince, the 10,000 Greek mercenaries found themselves in the most impossible survival situation of the ancient world. They had marched over 1,000 miles from the safety of the sea, crossed blistering deserts, and won a flawless tactical victory at the Battle of Cunaxa, only to watch their employer, Cyrus the Younger, die in the center of the fighting. Overnight, their massive paycheck and their entire reason for being in Asia vanished. To make a terrifying situation completely hopeless, the Persian satrap Tissaphernes offered them a fake peace treaty, invited their top generals to a banquet, and treacherously assassinated all of them. The greatest fighting force in the world was suddenly decapitated, trapped deep in hostile territory, completely surrounded by a massive imperial army, and entirely out of food. It was during this absolute lowest point, as the leaderless army lay weeping in the Mesopotamian dirt, that a young Athenian volunteer named Xenophon stepped out of the shadows. He was not a general or even a captain, but after experiencing a terrifying, divine dream, he realized that waiting for someone else to save them was a death sentence. Xenophon rallied the surviving junior officers in the dead of night, and delivered a masterpiece of psychological motivation. By dawn, he had convinced the terrified men to elect new commanders, burn their heavy baggage wagons, and form a massive, unyielding hollow square of bronze shields. They were no longer an invading army, they were a floating city fighting for its absolute survival. But their legendary retreat was immediately tested by the ruthless reality of Persian warfare. A Persian commander named Mithridates began attacking the slow, heavily armored Greek square using deadly hit-and-run tactics with archers and slingers. Recognizing that traditional Greek infantry could not catch a mobile enemy, Xenophon brilliantly and rapidly evolved their military machine. In a single night, he offered bounties to scrape together a makeshift cavalry from surviving baggage horses, and he recruited a lethal corps of slingers from the island of Rhodes who hurled dense lead bullets instead of rocks. The very next day, when the confident Persians closed in for another attack, Xenophon unleashed his new, long-range weapons and his shocking cavalry charge, completely shattering the Persian lines and proving that the 10,000 were still the most dangerous men in Asia. With the immediate threat of Mithridates temporarily crushed, the 10,000 pressed their advantage and marched fiercely northward along the eastern bank of the Tigris River. They were entering a landscape that was both desolate and hauntingly beautiful, completely unaware that they were marching directly over the bones of one of the greatest empires in human history. As the massive, silent ruins of the ancient Assyrian cities faded into the dust behind them, the 10,000 Greeks finally managed to outpace the pursuing army of Tissaphernes. But their relief was incredibly short-lived, because the geography of Mesopotamia was about to turn violently against them. They marched until they reached a point where the mighty Tigris River became entirely impassable. The water grew incredibly deep, and the sheer cliff faces of the surrounding mountains plunged directly into the churning river, leaving absolutely no banks for an army to march upon. The Greek generals realized they had reached a terrifying dead end. They could not go forward along the river, and turning back meant marching directly into the teeth of the great king's massive imperial army. To survive, they had to make a brutal choice. They turned east and looked up at a towering, jagged wall of stone. These were the Zagros Mountains, and they marked the border of a territory known as Cappadocia. The Cappadocians, who are widely considered by historians to be the ancient ancestors of the modern Kurds, were a fiercely independent mountain people. They recognized no king and paid no taxes to the Persian Empire. In fact, Xenophon recalled a chilling piece of local history. A few decades prior, the Persian king had sent a massive, heavily armed invasion force of 120,000 men into these very mountains to crush the Cappadocians. Not a single Persian soldier ever returned. Now, the surviving 10,000 Greeks had no choice but to march directly into that exact same meat grinder. The Greeks desperately tried to avoid a war. As their vanguard began the steep climb into the foothills, they sent heralds ahead to the Carduchian villages, promising that they only wanted safe passage through the mountains to reach the sea, and that they would pay for any food they took. The Carduchians did not send an envoy back. Instead, as night fell, the Greeks looked up and saw the mountain peaks in every direction suddenly ignite. The Carduchians were lighting massive signal fires, passing the message from peak to peak that a foreign army had entered their lands. The entire mountain range was mobilizing for war, and the Greeks were walking right into the trap. The moment the Greeks entered the narrow, winding mountain passes, the rules of warfare completely changed. The brilliant hollow square formation, which had saved them on the flat plains, was absolutely useless here. The passes were so incredibly narrow that the army was forced to stretch out into a thin, fragile column that extended for miles. The Carduchians, who knew every hidden ravine and cliff face, immediately began a terrifying campaign of guerrilla warfare. They did not wear heavy bronze armor, and they refused to fight the Greeks in hand-to-hand combat. Instead, they moved like ghosts along the high ridges, entirely out of reach of the Greek spears. The Carduchian weapons were specifically designed for this exact type of mountain slaughter. According to Xenophon's detailed accounts, they used massive, incredibly powerful bows that were nearly 3 feet long. To draw the bowstring back, the Carduchian archers actually had to place their left foot on the bottom of the bow to brace it. They fired arrows that were so thick and heavy they were essentially small javelins. These arrows struck with such catastrophic force that they effortlessly punched straight through the Greeks' heavy bronze shields and thick linen armor. When the Greek soldiers ran out of their own javelins, they actually gathered up the massive Carduchian arrows that had missed, fitted them with leather thongs, and threw them back. But the arrows were only half the nightmare. As the Greeks desperately tried to climb the steep, winding trails, the Carduchians would gather at the top of the cliffs and push massive, sheer boulders over the edge. The rocks would bounce and shatter on their way down, creating devastating avalanches of stone shrapnel that crushed the Greek soldiers marching below. The rearguard, commanded by Xenophon, took the absolute worst of this punishment. Because they were at the back of the line, they were constantly being ambushed from behind as they tried to protect the baggage train and the wounded. The pressure of this constant, invisible slaughter began to fracture the Greek high command. During one particularly brutal day, Xenophon's rearguard was pinned down by heavy fire and taking massive casualties. Xenophon sent desperate messengers to the front of the column, begging the Spartan general Chrysophus to halt the vanguard so the rear could catch up and regroup. But Chrysophus ignored the order and actually ordered his men to march even faster, leaving Xenophon and his soldiers completely isolated to fight a desperate, bloody retreat up the mountain. When Xenophon finally caught up to the Spartan that evening at their mountain camp, he was absolutely furious. He loudly confronted Chrysophus for abandoning them to die. But the Spartan grimly pointed ahead to the next mountain pass. It was entirely blocked by thousands of Carduchian warriors, and Chrysophus explained he had been sprinting all day in a desperate, failed attempt to seize that pass before the enemy could fortify it. They were completely surrounded, and they had to fight a terrifying nighttime battle just to dislodge the enemy and keep moving. It took the 10,000 exactly 7 agonizing days to fight their way through the Zagros Mountains. They were forced to abandon most of their remaining prisoners and pack animals just to move fast enough to survive. According to Xenophon's own haunting summary of the experience, The Greeks suffered more casualties, more terror, and more sheer misery in those 7 days against the Cadousians than they had in all their battles against the great king and Tissaphernes combined. But when they finally descended from the treacherous peaks, their nightmare was far from over. When the battered and bleeding vanguard of the 10,000 finally stumbled out of the jagged Cadousian mountain passes, they were met with a sight that must have felt like a cruel joke from the gods. Before them lay a wide, beautiful plain, and beyond it ran the Centrites River, which marked the official border into the province of Armenia. For a brief moment, the Greeks believed their nightmare was finally over. They marched down to the riverbanks, exhausted but relieved, fully expecting to cross into friendly territory and leave the terrifying mountain tribes behind them forever. But as they approached the rushing water, the horizon on the opposite bank began to darken. To their absolute horror, a brand new, fully armed Persian army was waiting for them on the Armenian side of the river. The Persian satrap of Armenia, a man named Orontes, had been warned of their approach. He had gathered a massive force of heavy cavalry and fierce Armenian mercenary infantry, and they were lined up in perfect battle formation directly across the only known shallow crossing, or ford, of the Centrites River. The Greeks quickly realized the terrifying reality of their geographic trap. The Centrites River was incredibly deep and fast-moving. When the Greek hoplites tried to wade into the water to test the crossing, the river immediately rose above their chests. In the ancient world, it was physically impossible to fight or even stand your ground in deep water while wearing 50 pounds of bronze armor and carrying a heavy oak shield. If they tried to slowly wade across the deep water, the Persian cavalry on the opposite bank would easily slaughter them with arrows and javelins before they ever reached the shore. To make a desperate situation completely hopeless, the Greeks looked over their shoulders and saw a terrifying sight. The fierce Cadousian mountain tribes, who had tormented them for the last 7 days, were pouring out of the mountain passes behind them. Thousands of Cadousian warriors were gathering on the high ground overlooking the river valley, preparing to charge down and crush the Greek rearguard. The 10,000 were perfectly pinned. If they stayed on the river bank, they would be slaughtered by the mountain tribes. If they tried to cross the deep water, they would be drowned or shot by the Persians. That night, the Greek camp was consumed by a quiet, suffocating despair. But just as he had done after the massacre of the generals, Xenophon experienced a profound and prophetic dream. He dreamed that his hands and feet were bound in heavy iron shackles, but suddenly, the chains snapped open and fell away entirely on their own, leaving him completely free to walk wherever he pleased. When Xenophon woke up the next morning, he felt a surge of divine confidence. He immediately found the Spartan general Chrysophus, and told him that the gods were about to offer them a miracle. Almost exactly as he said those words, 2 young Greek soldiers came running into the camp. They had been wandering upstream, away from the main army, looking for firewood. While searching the brush, they spotted an old man and a woman hiding clothes in a shallow rocky area of the river. The soldiers realized that the water in this specific spot was incredibly shallow, barely reaching their knees. Even better, the far bank at this new crossing point was surrounded by large rocks, which meant the deadly Persian cavalry could not charge down to the water's edge to stop an infantry crossing. The gods had delivered their miracle. Xenophon and Chrysophus immediately devised a brilliant, highly complex tactical fake-out to exploit this new crossing. They split the Greek army in half. Chrysophus took the vanguard and marched quietly upstream toward the newly discovered shallow ford. Xenophon stayed behind with the rearguard at the original, deep crossing. The Persian army on the opposite bank saw the Greeks splitting up and panicked, dividing their own forces to mirror the Greek movements. When Chrysophus reached the shallow water, his men stripped off their heavy cloaks, raised their spears, and charged across the river shouting their terrifying battle cries. The Persian infantry guarding the rocks on the other side were completely overwhelmed by the ferocity of the Greek heavy infantry, and immediately broke and ran. Chrysophus had successfully secured the Armenian side of the river. But back at the original crossing, Xenophon was still trapped on the wrong side of the water, and the thousands of Carduchian mountain warriors were finally charging down the hills to slaughter his isolated rearguard. What Xenophon did next is considered a masterpiece of military timing. As the terrifying Carduchian horde rushed toward the riverbank, Xenophon ordered his heavily armored hoplites to turn around and do the exact opposite of what the enemy expected. Instead of running toward the water, Xenophon ordered his men to sing the war hymn and sprint at full speed directly up the hill, charging head-on into the massive Carduchian army. The mountain tribes, completely shocked that this tiny, trapped rearguard was attacking them, panicked and turned to flee back up the mountain. The moment the Carduchians turned their backs, Xenophon blew the retreat trumpet. His heavy infantry immediately stopped their fake charge, spun around, and sprinted back down the hill to the river. Before the confused Carduchians could realize they had been tricked, Xenophon and his men were already plunging into the water, rapidly crossing the deep ford under the covering fire of their own archers who had crossed earlier with Chrysophus. By the time the mountain tribes reached the water's edge, the entire Greek army was standing safely on the Armenian shore. The 10,000 had broken the trap, and the harsh, freezing highlands of Armenia now stretched out before them. After the brilliant tactical escape across the Centrites River, the 10,000 Greek mercenaries finally left the terrifying Carduchian mountain tribes behind them. They had officially entered the vast, elevated plateau of Armenia. For the first few days, the march seemed almost peaceful. They were traversing a beautiful, seemingly endless expanse of rolling plains. The local Persian governor, a satrap named Anabasis, even rode out to meet them with a small cavalry escort. Anabasis offered a very simple treaty. If the Greeks promised not to burn the Armenian villages, he would allow them to take whatever food they needed and march safely through his territory. Exhausted and desperately needing supplies, the Greek generals eagerly accepted the truce. But the peace was an illusion, and the Greeks were about to face an enemy that bronze shields and tight formations could not defeat. It was late November, and they were marching through highlands that sit thousands of feet above sea level. Without any warning, the brutal Armenian winter slammed into the army. It began with a massive, relentless snowfall that blanketed the plains, accompanied by a howling, freezing north wind that cut straight through the Greeks' thin linen armor. According to Xenophon's own terrifying account in the Anabasis, the snow fell so heavily during the night that it completely buried the sleeping soldiers and their baggage animals. The men were actually afraid to stand up in the morning, finding a strange, temporary warmth under the thick blankets of snow. It wasn't until Xenophon himself grabbed an axe and began chopping firewood, stripping away his freezing, wet clothes to generate body heat through sheer physical labor, that the freezing soldiers were shamed into getting up and helping him. However, the march quickly turned into a literal death march. The generals discovered that Anabasis had broken his truce and was secretly shadowing the Greek army with his cavalry, waiting for the blizzards to weaken them so he could pick off the survivors. The environmental conditions were catastrophic. The glare of the high-altitude sun reflecting off the endless white plains caused widespread snow blindness. To prevent this, the soldiers had to march while holding anything dark they could find directly in front of their eyes. Worse still was the frostbite. The men were wearing traditional Greek sandals, which offered absolutely no protection against the freezing snowdrifts. If a soldier did not take his sandals off at night and constantly massage his feet, the leather straps would literally freeze into his flesh, and many men lost their toes to severe frostbite and gangrene. It was during this desperate trudge through the blizzards that the army was struck by a terrifying physical collapse. According to modern medical historians reviewing the ancient text, the soldiers began to suffer from acute hypoglycemic shock, a condition Xenophon specifically called bulimia, though it meant something very different in the ancient world than it does today. It was a sudden, ravenous, starving faintness. Hundreds of heavily armored hoplites simply collapsed in the snow, unable to take another step, their bodies completely depleted of energy and warmth. Xenophon, commanding the rearguard, had to run up and down the marching line, desperately forcing whatever scraps of bread and meat he could find into the mouths of the fallen men just to get their blood sugar high enough to stand back up. Those who could not stand were tragically left behind in the snow, easy prey for the pursuing Persian cavalry. Just when it seemed the freezing conditions would wipe out the entire army, the vanguard stumbled upon a bizarre and life-saving discovery. They found a series of Armenian villages, but the houses were not built above ground. To survive the brutal winters, the locals had built massive subterranean homes, completely underground, with narrow openings at the surface that looked like the mouths of wells. Down below, these excavated caves were massive and warm, housing not only the families but all of their goats, sheep, and cows. The starving, freezing Greeks poured into these underground villages and experienced their first real comfort in months. According to Xenophon, the villagers were actually quite hospitable once the Greeks promised not to harm them. It was here in the warm earth that the soldiers discovered a strange, potent local drink. They found massive vats filled with fermented barley and water, with the barley husks still floating on the top. To drink it without swallowing the husks, the Greeks used long, hollow reeds like giant straws. It was one of the earliest recorded encounters with beer in human history, and it provided the exact massive dose of calories and warmth the battered army desperately needed to survive their time in the freezing highlands. The 10,000 Greek mercenaries had survived the freezing, subterranean villages of Armenia, but their journey was far from over. When they finally emerged from the underground caves and resumed their march, the brief moment of comfort quickly evaporated. They had taken the local village headman as a captive guide to help them navigate the treacherous, snow-covered plains. But the stress of the brutal environment was beginning to fracture the Greek leadership. During one particularly grueling day of marching, the Spartan vanguard commander, Chrysophus, lost his temper. Frustrated by the lack of visible villages and the agonizing pace, he violently struck the captive guide. That night, deeply insulted and completely unguarded, the headman slipped away into the darkness, leaving the entire army stranded in the frozen wilderness. Xenophon was absolutely furious with Chrysophus for driving away their only navigator. It was the first major, bitter rift between the two commanders, a stark reminder that the brutal conditions were eroding their iron discipline. For the next week, the Greeks marched completely blind. They followed the winding path of the Phasis River, pushing through deep snow and surviving on rapidly dwindling rations. They soon crossed out of Armenia and entered the territory of the Taochians. This was a rugged, hostile region where the locals had abandoned their vulnerable valley villages and moved absolutely everything, their families, their livestock, and their food, into massive, heavily fortified mountain strongholds. The Greeks were now completely out of food. They could not simply bypass these fortresses. If they did not capture one, the entire army would starve to death in the mountains. Chrysophus led the vanguard to the base of the largest Taochian stronghold, a sheer rock outcropping completely surrounded by steep cliffs. The only way up was a narrow, exposed path. The Taochians knew this, and they had stockpiled thousands of massive boulders at the top. When the Greeks attempted to climb the path, the Taochians rolled the heavy stones down the cliffs. The rocks shattered on the way down, acting like explosive shrapnel that crushed the Greek hoplites and splintered their bronze shields. Xenophon and the rearguard arrived to find the vanguard pinned down, hungry, and bleeding. Realizing that a massive, unified charge would be suicidal, the Greek officers devised a brilliant tactical game of bait and switch. Small groups of lightly armored Greek soldiers began to run forward, intentionally drawing the enemy's fire, and then quickly diving behind a few large, protective trees at the base of the cliff. They did this over and over, essentially tricking the Taochians into wasting their ammunition. The Greeks watched as the terrifying hail of boulders began to slow down, and then finally stop. The Taochians had simply run out of rocks. The moment the cliffs went silent, the Greek officers sprinted up the narrow path, racing each other to be the first to breach the fortress. But when they finally crested the summit, they did not find a glorious battle. Instead, they witnessed one of the most horrifying scenes of the entire expedition. The Taochian civilians, realizing their fortress had fallen and terrified of being enslaved, engaged in a mass, horrifying suicide. The women of the stronghold began grabbing their own children and throwing them off the sheer cliffs to their deaths. Then, the women and the men threw themselves over the edge. One Greek captain, a man named Anabasis, actually tried to stop a wealthy-looking Taochian man from jumping by grabbing his heavy garments. But the momentum was too great, and the Taochian dragged the Greek captain right over the cliff with him, both men falling to their deaths. The Greeks captured virtually no prisoners that day, but they did secure a massive herd of cattle and sheep, saving the army from starvation. With their bellies finally full, the 10,000 pushed forward, directly into the lands of the Chalybes. Of all the hostile tribes the Greeks had faced, the Persians, the Cadousians, the Armenians, Xenophon explicitly recorded that the Chalybes were the most terrifying and lethal fighters of the entire journey. The Chalybes were legendary ironworkers, and they used their metallurgical skills to forge incredible weapons. They did not fight from a distance with arrows or slings. They wore thick linen corselets, heavy greaves, and carried massive spears that were over 20 feet long. Even more terrifying to the Greeks, the Chalybes actively sought out hand-to-hand combat. They would march right up to the invincible Greek hollow square and engage the hoplites in brutal, close-quarters slaughter. When the Chalybes killed a Greek soldier, they would decapitate the body and carry the severed head with them, singing and dancing to horrify the surviving mercenaries. It was a grueling, bloody slog, but the sheer, disciplined weight of the heavy Greek infantry eventually pushed through the Chalybian territory. They crossed the lands of the Macrons, where they negotiated a peaceful transit by exchanging their remaining bronze cups for food, and finally arrived at the foot of a massive, towering peak. The local guides told them this was Mount Thetches, the highest point in the entire region. It was early morning when the Spartan commander Chrysophus and the vanguard began the steep climb to the summit. Xenophon and the rearguard were miles behind, slowly driving the baggage train and the livestock up the winding mountain trails. Suddenly, Xenophon heard a sound that chilled his blood. From the top of the mountain, a massive, roaring shout echoed down the valley. Xenophon immediately assumed the worst. He believed the vanguard had been ambushed by another hostile mountain tribe, or perhaps the Chalybes had circled around to cut them off. The shouting grew louder, a chaotic, rolling wave of noise that seemed to gain momentum with every passing second. As the middle ranks of the Greek column heard the shout, they began to sprint up the mountain, adding their own voices to the roaring din. Xenophon didn't hesitate. He rallied his newly formed cavalry unit, ordered his fastest heavy infantry to drop their unnecessary gear, and spurred his horse into a desperate, galloping charge up the steep mountain path to save the vanguard. But as Xenophon and his men pushed closer to the summit, the chaotic noise began to resolve into a single, unified, repeating chant. It wasn't a battle cry. It wasn't a scream of terror. It was a word. Thousands of weeping, exhausted, battle-scarred men were standing on the peak of Mount Thetches, staring out at the northern horizon. They were dropping their heavy bronze shields. They were collapsing to their knees in the dirt. They were throwing their arms around each other, officers and ordinary soldiers alike, completely overcome by an impossible, overwhelming joy. As Xenophon finally broke through the crowd and reached the edge of the summit, he looked out and saw it too. Stretching out into the hazy distance, sparkling perfectly under the morning sun, was a massive, endless expanse of deep blue water. It was the Euxine Sea, known today as the Black Sea. The chant of the vanguard finally washed over Xenophon, the two most famous words in ancient military history, Thalata, Thalata. The sea, the sea. For the Greeks, the sea was not just a body of water. The sea was their home. It meant that the uncrossable deserts, the freezing mountains, and the millions of hostile subjects of the great king were finally behind them. It meant that for the first time in 2 years, they had a road back to their families. In a spontaneous outpouring of emotion, the soldiers began gathering massive stones from the mountainside, building a towering, monumental cairn right there on the peak. They decorated the stone monument with captured Persian shields and walking sticks, a permanent, triumphant testament that the 10,000 had marched to the very center of the world, and against all impossible odds, they had fought their way back out. The jubilant echoes of Thalata, Thalata, had barely faded from the peaks of Mount Thetches, but the 10,000 still had a few days of marching before they could actually touch the waters of the Euxine Sea. The descent from the mountains brought them into the territory of the Colchians, a fierce kingdom located on the southeastern coast of the Black Sea. This was the legendary land of Colchis, famous in Greek mythology as the destination of Jason and the Argonauts in their quest for the Golden Fleece. As the Greek army marched down the slopes, they found their path completely blocked. A massive Colchian army had assembled on a high mountain ridge directly overlooking the road to the coast. The Greek commanders quickly realized that their traditional, rigid phalanx formation would be a disaster on this uneven terrain. If they marched up the steep, broken ground in a solid block, the line would inevitably split, causing the men to panic. Xenophon and the generals implemented their final, brilliant tactical evolution of the retreat. Instead of a solid wall of bronze, they broke the army into independent companies of about 100 men each. They spaced these companies out, creating a flexible, porous line that could move rapidly over the rocks without losing its shape. When the Greeks charged up the mountain in these small, highly disciplined shock units, the Colchians were completely overwhelmed. The enemy line fractured, and the Colchian army fled in absolute disarray, leaving the road to the coast wide open. With the final battle won, the exhausted mercenaries descended into the fertile Colchian valleys and captured a cluster of wealthy villages. After months of starvation and freezing conditions, the men were overjoyed to find the storehouses overflowing with provisions. But the most tempting discovery was the massive apiaries. The Colchians kept thousands of swarming beehives, and the villages were filled to the brim with incredibly rich, golden honeycomb. The starving soldiers immediately broke into the hives and began gorging themselves on the raw honey. What followed is one of the most bizarre and terrifying medical anomalies recorded in ancient military history. Almost immediately after eating the honey, the soldiers began to collapse. Men who had just survived the frozen Armenian highlands and the brutal Chalybian warriors were suddenly dropping their weapons and falling to their knees, violently ill. They suffered from uncontrollable vomiting and severe dysentery. The most horrifying symptoms were neurological. According to Xenophon, the soldiers entirely lost their sense of balance and their ability to stand upright. Those who had only eaten a little bit of the honey stumbled around the village like men who were blackout drunk. Those who had eaten a large amount went completely mad, hallucinating, and thrashing on the ground in a state of wild delirium, while others slipped into a deep, terrifying coma. By nightfall, the Greek camp looked exactly like the aftermath of a catastrophic military defeat. Thousands of heavily armored veterans were lying incapacitated in the dirt, completely helpless. If the Colchians had counterattacked that night, the 10,000 would have been entirely wiped out without a single sword being drawn. What the Greeks did not know, and what modern toxicologists have since discovered, is that the bees in this specific region of the Black Sea coast forage heavily on a local species of rhododendron flowers. These vibrant flowers contain a powerful neurotoxin known as granotoxin. When the bees concentrate this nectar into honey, it creates a highly toxic substance known historically as mad honey. It causes a massive drop in blood pressure and a dangerous slowing of the heart rate, leading to the exact terrifying symptoms Xenophon described. Miraculously, the granotoxin was not lethal in the doses the soldiers had consumed. The next morning, at almost the exact same hour they had eaten the honey the day before, the soldiers began to wake up. Their minds slowly cleared from the delirium. By the third day, the men were finally able to stand, though they were incredibly weak, feeling as though they had just survived a massive, agonizing fever. Once the army had recovered enough to march, they packed up their gear for what would be the very last time in hostile territory. They marched for 2 more days, finally leaving the mountain valleys behind and stepping out onto the warm, sandy beaches of the Black Sea. Before them stood the towering walls of Trapezus, a wealthy Greek coastal colony known today as Trabzon. For the first time in over a year, the mercenaries heard their native language spoken by merchants and fishermen. They saw Greek ships bobbing in the harbor, and they were welcomed not as invaders, but as long-lost brothers who had somehow returned from the dead, the 10 Thous, and pitched their camp by the sea and stayed for a month, resting their battered bodies and healing their wounds. To honor the gods who had delivered them from the heart of the Persian Empire, they held massive religious sacrifices, offering their deepest thanks to Zeus the Savior and Hercules the Guide. They concluded their celebration with traditional Greek athletic games. The soldiers marked out a racecourse right there on the steep, grassy hill leading down to the water. The hardened veterans, men who had marched thousands of miles and fought empires, now stripped off their heavy armor to compete in foot races, wrestling, and boxing. When the horses were brought out for the cavalry race, the steep slope made the animals slip and tumble, sending their riders crashing into the dirt, causing massive, roaring laughter to echo across the beach. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. They had lost their leader, their generals, and many of their friends. They had endured starvation, betrayal, and the freezing limits of human endurance. But as they looked out over the sparkling blue waters of the sea, the surviving mercenaries knew they had achieved the impossible. The legendary retreat was over, and they were finally home. Reaching the Black Sea was the emotional climax of the expedition, but the brutal reality of their situation quickly set back in. The 10,000 were still hundreds of miles away from Greece proper, and they had absolutely no money, no ships, and no food. The Spartan general Chrysophus volunteered to sail ahead to Byzantium, modern-day Istanbul, to secure a fleet of ships from the Spartan admiral stationed there. He promised to return quickly and carry the army home in comfort. So, the rest of the army set up camp near Trapezus and waited. And they waited. Weeks turned into months, and Chrysophus did not return. As their supplies dwindled, the men were forced to launch violent raiding parties against the surrounding local tribes just to avoid starvation. Realizing that no rescue fleet was coming, Xenophon and the remaining generals had to make a bitter decision. They packed up their camp and began the grueling march westward along the rugged coastline of the Black Sea. This final leg of the journey was characterized not by glorious battles against the Persians, but by the slow, tragic breakdown of the army's iron discipline. They were no longer united by the immediate threat of annihilation. Instead, they fractured into greedy factions. They mutinied against their officers, sacked friendly Greek coastal cities, and at one point, the army actually threatened to stone Xenophon to death when a rumor spread that he was secretly planning to sail them back to Asia. Using his incredible skills in public speaking, Xenophon barely managed to talk his way out of the execution. When the battered, impoverished remnants of the 10,000 finally reached the shores of the Bosporus and crossed over into Europe, they expected to be welcomed as heroes. Instead, the local Spartan governor viewed this massive, hungry, heavily armed mob of mercenaries as a terrifying threat to his own power. He locked the gates of Byzantium, betrayed the generals, and essentially left the Greek army stranded in the freezing wilderness of Thrace to starve. Completely desperate, Xenophon negotiated a new mercenary contract for his men. He hired the army out to a Thracian prince named Xeuths, who was fighting a brutal civil war to reclaim his father's kingdom. And so, the 10,000 found themselves fighting a completely new type of war. Instead of the scorching Mesopotamian deserts, they were now fighting in the freezing, pitch-black Thracian winter. They conducted terrifying night raids against mountain villages, burning down houses and capturing thousands of slaves. With the unmatched shock power of the Greek heavy infantry, Prince Xeuths easily crushed his rivals and took his throne. But as soon as he was in power, the Thracian prince betrayed them. He flatly refused to pay the mercenaries the massive wages he had promised, leaving the army just as broke and desperate as before. Just as the army was on the verge of entirely dissolving into banditry, a dramatic shift in global politics saved them. The Spartan Empire had officially declared war on the Persian Empire. The Spartans were sending an army across the Aegean Sea to invade Asia Minor, and the Spartan general in charge, a man named Thimbron, desperately needed experienced veterans. He crossed into Thrace, paid the 10,000 their back wages, and officially incorporated the survivors into the Spartan military machine. For the soldiers, this was the end of the road. They had survived. But for Xenophon, returning home to Athens was no longer an option. While he had been away fighting in Asia, the political climate in Athens had drastically changed. His beloved mentor, the philosopher Socrates, had been put on trial and executed by the Athenian state. Furthermore, Xenophon had just spent the last 2 years fighting side by side with Spartan generals, and Athens fiercely hated Sparta. Because of his association with Socrates and his mercenary work for Spartan interests, the city of Athens officially exiled Xenophon. He was banished from his homeland, under penalty of death if he ever returned. With nowhere else to go, Xenophon fully embraced his Spartan allies. He became a close personal friend and military advisor to the Spartan king Agesilaus. In a bitter twist of fate, Xenophon actually marched with the Spartan army back into Greece and fought at the Battle of Chaeronea against an alliance of Greek cities that included his own hometown of Athens. To reward his absolute loyalty, the Spartan government gifted Xenophon a magnificent, sprawling country estate in a lush region called Scyllus, located just a few miles from the sacred site of Olympia. After years of starvation, freezing mountains, and constant bloodshed, Xenophon finally found his peace. He lived on his estate for over 20 years as a wealthy, aristocratic gentleman farmer. He spent his days hunting wild boar, breeding horses, and managing his land. But most importantly, he spent his time writing. Sitting in his quiet study in the Peloponnese, he compiled his diaries and memories of the great expedition. He wrote the Anabasis, ensuring that the unbelievable bravery, the tactical genius, and the tragic sacrifices of the 10,000 would never be forgotten. He also wrote extensive treatises on horsemanship, military cavalry tactics, and hunting, as well as philosophical dialogues defending the memory of Socrates. Towards the very end of his life, the geopolitical landscape shifted one final time. Sparta suffered a catastrophic military defeat at the hands of the Thebans, and Xenophon was forced to flee his beautiful estate at Scyllus. He relocated to the city of Corinth. Shortly after this, Athens and Sparta actually formed a desperate alliance to survive the rising power of Thebes. Because of this new alliance, the city of Athens finally revoked Xenophon's exile. Though he was legally allowed to return to the city of his birth, it is unclear if the old general ever actually went back to Athens. He had left as a young, ambitious volunteer, and he was now a famous, battle-scarred old man. Xenophon died quietly, likely in Corinth, around the year 354 BCE. He left behind a legacy that would permanently alter the course of Western history. Less than a century later, a young Macedonian prince named Alexander the Great would read Xenophon's Anabasis. Alexander realized that if 10,000 stranded, starving Greeks could march through the heart of the Persian Empire and survive, then a fully supplied, unified Greek army could conquer it entirely. To understand exactly how Xenophon actually wrote the Anabasis, we have to transition from the bloody battlefields of the Persian Empire to the quiet, rolling hills of the Greek Peloponnese. The creation of this book is not just a story of a retired soldier writing his memoirs. It is a story of political exile, brilliant public relations, and a desperate need to defend a legacy. For a podcast, this makes a fascinating shift in tone, showing the man behind the myth. Here is a detailed look at how and why the Anabasis was written, formatted perfectly for your text-to-speech software. After decades of constant warfare, surviving the retreat of the 10,000, and subsequently fighting as a mercenary for the Spartan Empire, Xenophon finally laid down his shield. As a reward for his unwavering loyalty, the Spartan government gifted him a sprawling, magnificent country estate in a lush region called Scyllus, located just a few miles from the sacred Olympic Games. For a man who had spent his youth starving in the snows of Armenia and dodging Persian arrows, Scyllus was absolute paradise. He lived there for over 20 years as a wealthy, aristocratic gentleman farmer. He spent his days hunting wild boar, riding his favorite horses, and managing his orchards. But Xenophon was not the kind of man to simply fade into obscurity. He had experienced one of the most incredible adventures in human history, and he had a quiet study, plenty of wealth, and all the time in the world to write it down. But how did he actually remember all the details? The Anabasis is incredibly specific. Xenophon records the exact number of miles marched each day, the specific names of obscure Persian villages, the exact amount of money the soldiers were paid, and the day-to-day weather conditions. Human memory is entirely incapable of recalling that level of logistical detail 20 years after the fact. Most modern historians agree that Xenophon must have kept a detailed campaign diary, or field notes, during the actual expedition. Even while he was commanding the rearguard, fighting off mountain tribes and suffering from frostbite, the young Athenian was somehow finding the time to sit by the campfire and record the distances they traveled, measuring them in the Persian unit of distance known as the parasang. When he finally sat down at his desk in Silice 2 decades later, he was not pulling the story from thin air. He was expanding upon a meticulously kept military logbook. However, Xenophon had a massive, pressing motive for publishing this book that went far beyond simple historical record-keeping. He was writing to defend his own life and his honor. While Xenophon had been away fighting in Asia, the political climate in his hometown of Athens had turned violently against him. The Athenian government had put his beloved mentor, the philosopher Socrates, on trial and executed him. Part of the reason Socrates was killed was because several of his famous students had turned out to be enemies of the Athenian democracy. Xenophon, who was actively working as a mercenary for Athens' greatest rival, Sparta, was viewed as a traitor. The city of Athens officially exiled him, banning him from his homeland under penalty of death. Xenophon knew that his name was being dragged through the mud back in Athens. The Anabasis was his chance to set the record straight and clear his name in the court of public opinion. Throughout the book, he goes to great lengths to portray himself not as a greedy, anti-Athenian mercenary, but as a deeply pious, reluctant leader who only took command because it was the will of the gods. He specifically includes the story of how he consulted Socrates and the Oracle of Delphi before leaving, proving that he was a good, God-fearing Greek. But this created a major literary problem. If Xenophon published a book under his own name, where he constantly portrayed himself as a brilliant tactician, a flawless speaker, and the ultimate savior of the 10,000, the Greek public would have completely rejected it as arrogant, self-serving propaganda. To solve this, Xenophon pulled off one of the greatest literary deceptions in history. When the Anabasis was finally finished, he did not put his name on the scroll. Instead, he released it into the ancient world under a completely fake pseudonym, Themistogenes of Syracuse. Furthermore, he wrote the entire book in the third person. He never uses the word I. Instead, he writes sentences like, "Then Xenophon stood up and addressed the men," or "Xenophon rode his horse to the front of the line." By presenting the book as an objective, third-party history written by an entirely different soldier, the Greek public swallowed the story hook, line, and sinker. They read about the brilliant, heroic young Athenian named Xenophon, entirely unaware that Xenophon was the one pulling the strings behind the curtain. It was a masterpiece of public relations. By the time the true identity of the author leaked out and became common knowledge in the ancient world, the book was already a massive, undeniable bestseller. The Anabasis achieved exactly what Xenophon wanted. It secured his reputation not as a traitor to Athens, but as one of the greatest military commanders and literary minds of his generation, ensuring his name would be remembered for thousands of years. The survival of the Anabasis begins with a fascinating piece of ancient literary deception. When Xenophon finally retired to his massive country estate in Silice, he sat down to write the definitive history of the expedition. But he faced a major public relations problem. Throughout the story, Xenophon is constantly making brilliant decisions, saving the army, and giving incredibly heroic speeches. If he published the book under his own name, the Greek public would have completely dismissed it as arrogant, self-serving propaganda. To solve this, Xenophon published the Anabasis under a fake name. He released the book into the ancient world under the pseudonym Themistogenes of Syracuse. He wanted the readers to believe it was an objective, third-party historical account written by an entirely different soldier. It wasn't until years later, long after the book had become wildly popular, that the true identity of the author became an open secret in the ancient world. The book became an instant, massive bestseller in antiquity for one very specific reason. Xenophon wrote in a dialect called Attic Greek, the language of Athens. But unlike other philosophers or historians who wrote in dense, confusing, and highly poetic language, Xenophon wrote like a soldier. His sentences were crisp, clear, completely unadorned, and highly factual. Because his writing was so structurally perfect and easy to read, the Anabasis quickly became the absolute standard textbook for anyone in the ancient world who wanted to learn how to read and speak Greek. Because it was used as a foundational educational text, the Anabasis found its way into the hands of the most powerful people in history. Less than a century after Xenophon died, a young prince named Alexander the Great was given a world-class education by the philosopher Aristotle. We know for a fact that Alexander read Xenophon's work. To Alexander, the Anabasis was not just a history book. It was a military blueprint. Xenophon had inadvertently proved a massive geopolitical vulnerability. He had shown that the interior of the Persian Empire was essentially hollow, and that the massive Persian armies could not stand up to disciplined, heavily armored Greek infantry. When Alexander the Great launched his own massive invasion of the Persian Empire, he was directly following the path and the psychological playbook laid out by Xenophon. Later Roman commanders, including Julius Caesar and the general Arrian, also studied Xenophon obsessively to learn how to manage mutinous troops and navigate hostile terrain. But being popular in the ancient world did not guarantee survival. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed and Europe plunged into the Dark Ages, countless masterpieces of ancient literature were burned, lost, or simply rotted away in abandoned libraries. Western Europe entirely forgot how to read Greek, and the Anabasis was nearly lost to history forever. The only reason the story of the 10,000 survived is because of the Eastern Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantine Empire. Headquartered in the massive, fortified city of Constantinople, the Byzantines still spoke and read Greek. Deep inside the Byzantine monasteries, generations of anonymous, dedicated monks spent their entire lives sitting in candlelit scriptoriums. They painstakingly copied the Anabasis by hand, letter by letter, onto animal parchment. Every single modern copy of the Anabasis that we read today traces its lineage back to these medieval Byzantine monks. The absolute oldest physical manuscript of the Anabasis that still exists in the world today is known as the Codex Vaticanus 1335. It was copied by hand in the 12th century, more than 1,000 years after Xenophon actually wrote it, and it is currently held in the Vatican Library. The final, dramatic chapter of the book's survival occurred in the year 1453. The city of Constantinople finally fell to the invading Ottoman Empire. As the ancient walls were breached and the city burned, Greek scholars desperately gathered up their most precious, ancient manuscripts and fled westward on ships toward Italy. Among these rescued treasures were the hand-copied manuscripts of Xenophon. When these Greek scholars arrived in Italy, they helped spark the Renaissance. Western European thinkers were suddenly reintroduced to the brilliant, clear Greek writing of Xenophon. Around this exact same time, the printing press was invented. By the early 1500s, the Anabasis was being mass-produced in printed type, translated into Latin, French, English, and Italian. Because of its incredibly clear grammar, the Anabasis once again became the universal textbook for teaching students how to read ancient Greek. For hundreds of years, right up into the 20th century, almost every single university student in Europe and the United States who studied the classics had to translate the exact same opening lines of Xenophon's book. They all learned the famous Greek phrase, "in Teuthen Exeloniai," which translates to, "From there, he marched." And that is how the story of 10,000 starving, desperate mercenaries survived the collapse of empires, the burning of libraries, and the passage of 2.5 millennia, allowing us to still tell their story today.